Religion, more particularly Christianity, is as much a part of the American story and the formation of American civilization as anything else, perhaps even more so. Since our nation's inception, the acknowledgement, practice, principles, and place of Christian faith have been a conscious, intentional, and in many instances, officially sanctioned contribution to our American identity, function, and character. And I would argue Christian faith, along with all faiths, are as important in the public life of Americans as much as they are in the private sphere. And nothing less than the history of our iconic Capitol building proves these points. Most people know at least a little about the storied history of the United States Capitol. They may know about the contest that was held over its design. They may know it was burned by the British during the War of 1812, or that the big dome was added fairly late. They may know the building was used as a hospital and even as a bakery for Union troops. What few people know is the rich religious history of the Capitol. In many ways, it could be called the first People's Cathedral as much as the People's House. What I would suggest was, in fact, the first religious service held at the U.S. Capitol occurred before there was even a building on the grounds. On September the 18th, 1793, His Excellency, George Washington, laid the cornerstone of the soon-to-be erected Capitol in a Masonic ceremony. Now, no doubt some of you are familiar with its protocol. It included prayers, anointing with oil, and according to the current architect of the Capitol, the encasement of a Bible. Regular worship services began in the Capitol as early as 1795, even before the Congress convened in its new chambers. Then, in 1800, official approval for the Capitol to be used as a church came by way of orders from the Speaker of the House, Theodore Sedgwick, and the then President of the Senate, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson would go on to attend divine services in the Capitol every Sunday during his presidency. Massachusetts Congressman Manasseh Cutler, a clergyman, I might add, wrote in an 1803 letter to a Dr. Torrey that Jefferson even braved bad weather on horseback to get to the hall to worship. Incidentally, Jefferson began his habit of Sunday worship at the Capitol just days after he penned that famous, now infamous, 1801 letter to the Danbury Association of Baptists. The same letter from which, nearly a century and a half later, the U.S. Supreme Court would poach the phrase, wall of separation between church and state. Dr. Hudson, a great friend of mine, the man whom I've already mentioned, Yale PhD in American history, served on the faculties at Yale and William and Mary, and since 1982 has been chief of the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, has published some very convincing scholarship that debunks the prevailing notion of separation. Dr. Hudson successfully urged the Congress to commission the FBI to use new technology to lift Jefferson's blotted out textual and marginal notes on the Danbury draft letters to reveal that the letter was really largely a political appeasement for the distressed Baptists of New England. They feared Jefferson's Church of Virginia would become the established federal church, and that they might be drowned in creeks like their fellow Baptists had been in awful Virginia. In any case, on that Sunday, after the Danbury letter, a Baptist, the Reverend John Leland, took to the Capitol pulpit to expound on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12 and verse 22. Behold, a greater than Solomon is here, clearly referencing the great Virginian and statesman. Other presidents, along with members and senators, of course, would continue the custom of attending services in the People's House. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, would arrive each Sunday morning, somewhat ostentatiously. Unlike Jefferson's lone riding on horseback, Madison would come to church always in a coach and four. According to historian David Barton, with whom I visited last Saturday in Houston for Governor, now candidate Perry's Day of Prayer at Reliance Stadium, wrote this: from 1800 to 1801, services were held in the north wing of the Capitol. From 1801 to 1804, they were held in the oven in the south wing. And then from 1804 to 1807, they were again held in the north wing. From 1807 to 1857, services were held in what is now Statuary Hall. By 1857, when the House moved into its new home in the extension, some 2,000 persons a week were attending services in the hall of the House. Significantly, even though the U.S. Congress began meeting in the extension on Wednesday, December 16, 1857, the first official use of the House chamber had occurred 3 days earlier, when on December 13, 1857, the Reverend Dr. George Cummins preached before a crowd of more than 2,000 worshipers in the first public use of that chamber. Soon thereafter, the committee recommended that the House convene in the new hall on Wednesday, December 16, 1857. However, regardless of the part of the building in which the church met, the rostrum of the Speaker of the House was used as the preacher's pulpit, and Congress purchased the hymnals used in the services. Incidentally, Congress not only purchased hymnals, it actually commissioned the printing of Bibles as early as 1782, when it was still the Congress of the Confederation. This over century and a half of unbridled spirituality under the dome had some real highlights. The Library of Congress records a visit by one of America's early female preachers, Evangelist Dorothy Ripley, who in 1806 delivered a camp meeting style exhortation to the House, in which Jefferson, Vice President Aaron Burr, and a crowded audience were in attendance. Now, the Library of Congress did not make it clear whether Evangelist Ripley preached against dueling, as many of her contemporary pulpiteers did, but if she did, Burr must have been snoozing at that point. Minister of the Baltimore New Jerusalem Church, John Hargrove, warned his congressional audience of the imminent return of Christ in a Christmas Day sermon in 1804, delivered, in his words, in prophecy under the style of the Joshua of the American Temple. The pastor got so wound up, he actually took up a spontaneous collection to support Lady Washington's Chapel, a Bible study held at a nearby hotel where he was teaching on God's plan as it unfolded in the American Revolution. America's Sanctuary also hosted the first officially approved Catholic homily, delivered on January 8, 1826, by Bishop John England of Charleston, South Carolina. The overflow audience included President John Quincy Adams, whose July 4, 1821 speech the bishop rebutted in his sermon. Adams had asserted that the Roman Catholic Church was intolerant of other religions and therefore incompatible with Republican institutions. Bishop England responded that, quote, "We do not believe that God gave to the church any power to interfere with our civil rights or our civil concerns. I would not allow to the Pope or to any bishop of our church the smallest interference with the humblest vote at our most insignificant balloting box." According to the office of the Clerk of the House of Representatives, preacher Henry Highland Garnett became the first African American to speak in the House chamber. He addressed a crowd of worshipers, and prior to Garnett's sermon, African Americans had been banned from both congressional chambers since the late 1820s. House Chaplain William Henry Channing had invited Garnett to commemorate the House's approval of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Garnett spoke to a crowded chamber, complete with a choir from his 15th Street Presbyterian Church. While the context was a religious sermon, Garnett challenged Congress to emancipate, enfranchise, and to educate. The oratory received mixed reviews from the newspapers. The Washington Daily Times called it shameful, while the Weekly Anglo-African referred to it as dazzling. Now, having said all of this, and Don, for your sake, if you are lamenting the loss of these auspicious spiritual exercises on the Hill, then let me encourage you. On Sunday, March the 21st, 2010, history was made, or shall I say, remade, in the U.S. Capitol. At 11 a.m. on that Sunday, as members of Congress were in session to vote on health care legislation, Congressman Randy Forbes of Virginia's 4th District and co-chair of the House Prayer Caucus organized the first church service in the Capitol in 130 years. Held in Statuary Hall, it drew over 250 worshipers, including members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, their spouses, and their staff members. No legislation was discussed. No political agenda was present. According to Representative Forbes, the only matter at hand was acknowledgement of faith and recognition of our nation's spiritual heritage. So the acknowledgement of God and His place in our nation's life continues apace in that gleaming, unmistakable edifice situated atop what was once Jenkins Hill with its commanding view of the Potomac. It will be impossible to ever evict the Almighty from any point on earth, for it is, according to Isaiah 66:1, the Lord's footstool. And the United States Capitol is simply one of the more handsome finials on that piece of cosmic furniture. God is as much in the people's house today as He's ever been. Just don't tell the ACLU that. Thank you.